The director of the film was a man named Elia Kazan. And Kazan, during the 1930s, had been associated with the group theater, which was a fairly radical left-wing theater company that produced many of the original plays by Clifford Odets. And like many of the people who had been of the group theater in the 1930s and who were desperately alarmed at the state of America in the long drawn-out Depression and at the state of the world as fascist leaders rose and were being more and more accommodated, there was a period in Kazan's life where he joined the Communist Party. He was there for about 15 months. And if you read Kazan's autobiography, a book called A Life, and really one of the great books that deals with American show business and theatrical arts, you will hear him admit that he was a very, very bad communist because he was a deeply rebellious, disobedient person. And if you were going to be in the Communist Party in the 1930s, it was important that you be quiet and secretive about it and do exactly as you were told and try to recruit other likely people for your local cell branch meeting. And discipline, we're talking about the age of Stalin, discipline in the Communist Party was the most important thing. And Kazan was constitutionally undisciplined, self-centered, in the best kind of way, and never a man who would last. But he never denied that he had been a member of the Communist Party. Well, after the war, he became initially the leading director on the Broadway stage. He directed the breakthrough plays by Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller. He did the first production of Death of a Salesman, and he had done the first production of A Streetcar Named Desire, which was the second play on which he had been involved with Marlon Brando. Kazan was one of the people who discovered Brando, who was then an extraordinarily beautiful, little educated, shy, sensitive kid. And he insisted on Brando playing the part of Stanley Kowalski in a streetcar when the producers of the play had been much more inclined to cast John Garfield or even Burt Lancaster or even Anthony Quinn, who played the part when the play went on the road. And Brando was less known and experienced than any of those three. But Kazan had this feeling that he had stumbled upon maybe one of the great American actors of all time. And Kazan, in his book, says how lucky he was that he found two of the great American actors of all time, because very shortly thereafter he would be instrumental in the discovery of James Dean. Now, that wasn't chance. Actors of a special new type who wanted to seem not like actors, who wanted to seem just like people, were drawn to Kazan because Kazan had a way of directing that burrowed deep into the psychology of his players and insisted that his actors identify with the characters and find a sense memory of their own life that explained their characters, because he really wanted to draw upon their own creative and nervous energy. He did not want them to pretend. And it was an age in which American acting grew weary of pretending. It wanted to be. Now, there's a very big philosophical problem behind that we don't need to get into, but it was the pressing need of the age. And Kazan and Brando were instrumental in changing the way Americans thought of acting. And as he became successful on stage, Streetcar is 47. He was invited to Hollywood, and he started to direct films, and he made a film called Gentleman's Agreement, which won the Best Picture of, I think, 47, might be 48, and I think is one of the worst Best Pictures of all time. And Kazan did not like the film himself, and he felt, and talks about it again in the book, how he had not found himself as a director of films. He didn't really understand that medium yet. He knew how he could put his own energy into a play. And he made Stanley in Streetcar very much an extension of himself. And many people have said, rather change the text of the play in doing it. But on film, he hadn't found how you assert your personality, if that's what you want to do, in directing in the same kind of way. But he was pursuing a film career, and by the late 40s, two things were big in his life. With Arthur Miller, who had been a friend for a long time, he was working on a story about the New Jersey waterfront. It was called The Hook. And they were developing it together, and it was not at all distant from On the Waterfront. And they were having trouble with it because the studios were increasingly wary of material which seemed to be critical of American structures, particularly of American business. What was coming, what had started in 47 again, was the attempt by the House Un-American Activities Committee, before McCarthy, under a man named Parnell Thomas, first of all, to pick upon people in the movie industry who might have old left-wing associations which allegedly had turned Hollywood into a factory of radical ideas. Now, if you want to understand the mood of paranoia and fear that existed in America at that time, in the late 40s, in the age of McCarthyism, there is no easier way of getting there than to say that millions of Americans who had been raised on Hollywood pictures could persuade themselves that those pictures had been tacit radicalism. I think that they are one of the great expressions of freedom and joy and happiness and having a good time. And it was a miracle that anyone could be so afraid of other things in the world that they could believe that there was a conspiracy afoot in Hollywood. But so it was believed. And for the people whose business it was to make this a firebrand, you could certainly point to the fact that a number of people in Hollywood had been members of the Communist Party at one time. Somebody once said, well, if you weren't a member of the Communist Party in the 1930s, you must have been sleeping awfully deeply. In other words, to be a member of the Communist Party in that time really was not quite as deeply shocking as we were told it was. It was a natural thing. I have a 16-year-old, and I hope that at that time he would have been a member of the Communist Party, and I hope that I would have been. It might have been a mistaken decision, but as you will remember, Americans are allowed to make mistakes. And you can belong to a party even if it's the wrong party. Anyway, it was a strange mood, and no need to dwell upon it too much, although it's coming back into fashion. The new film, Good Night and Good Luck, is very much about that time. And for those of you who are too young and have never seen Joseph McCarthy, you have a chance in that film to see what he was like. Anyway, the other great pressing force in Kazan's life was that he had had representations made to him through his agents, his managers, that really, if he wanted to continue a productive, happy career in filmmaking, he really ought to testify to the committee, could do it secretly, and name names. Name the people that he had known at the Communist Party meetings he had been to in the 1930s, just to help clear it all up. And Kazan, who was a man for whom integrity was enormously important, went through a year or so of agony about this. He knew that he was being sought by scoundrels to betray old friends. He knew enough to know that he might, in naming some names, destroy careers. And there were people who did not work for years or for the rest of their lives. There were people blacklisted who committed suicide. It was a terrible, terrible time. And Kazan was under no illusions about the risks that went with testifying. He was also, by then, we're talking about an age in which Russia had acquired nuclear weapons, an age in which it was no longer as possible to be as rosy in your view of Russian communism as it had been in the 1930s, with Chinese communism on the march. An age in which to hate communism was nearly as natural as it might have been to be tempted by it in the 1930s. And he agonized. And if you read the book, it's called A Life, he gives a very candid portrait. But he also was a man desperate to work. And for him, work was directing. And for me, it's writing. For people here, I don't know. It may be completely different things, but you know how much a part of you work can be, how passionate you are about it. And to be cut off from your work can be a terrible thing. And in the end, I think it was that need to work and the terror of being stopped working. But he named names. He testified in secret. The secret testimony was almost immediately leaked, because that's the way it went those days. He wrote a sort of early op-ed piece for the New York Times on why he had done it, on why he had felt that need, and he was candid in the piece about how mixed his motives were. And from that day forward, there were people whom he had known since, well, teenage years sometimes, who never spoke to him again. About, my memory slips, but I would say about 7 or 8 years ago, he was given an honorary Oscar by the Academy. It seemed to me an unnecessary award, a provocative award in some ways, in that he had won for himself and for other people in his lifetime many Oscars, many actors under him. Brando and Eva Marie Saint here won Oscars. He had won the Best Director twice. Best Picture he'd been involved with twice. He was still alive, very old man, and the Academy decided to give him another Oscar, a kind of lifetime achievement Oscar. And the pavilion where the Oscars are given was picketed. There were people who would not stand up when he came on stage. You may have seen it. It was only a few years ago. It was still a burning, burning issue. And I know people who will die cursing Kazan for what he represented, and because he was probably the most famous and the most successful of the people who turned and testified. I knew him a little bit, and I can only say to you and to those people that Kazan would have agreed with them. He knew he had done a terrible thing. I think he felt it was an inescapable thing for him. And whatever else you may think about what he did, it took great courage. Sometimes to be evil takes great courage, just as being good takes great courage. It's an immensely problematic situation. And it was enormously aggravated for his enemies by this film. And I think if you pause to reflect for a moment, you can see it's a film about testifying on your old friends. Now, it's done within the framework of a union film. And certainly, Johnny Friendly is a pretty loathsome piece of work. And testifying against a killer, particularly when you've got the beautiful, winsome, blonde Eva Marie Saint waiting for you. In terms of the melodrama of this story, it's a very natural, proper thing to do. But for those people who were the self-declared enemies of Kazan, it was truly and doubly revolting that the Fink had then gone out and made a film that justified being a Fink in such a big, broad, dramatic, and successful way. And in those minds, Kazan was locked away for all time, never forgiven. And I don't know the answer. I do think, as a critic, something extraordinary happened. In the process of testifying and in becoming both the hero and the villain in his own life, Kazan found himself as a film director. I think his movies, from the moment he testifies, have a much greater power. They're East of Eden, Face in the Crowd, Wild River, Baby Doll. I think he became a greater director. And for him, that may have been a very important part of the bargain. Now, you know, it seems like something that all happened a long time ago. I happen to know a good few people on both sides of the issue, and so it lives in my memory and in my sense. But you may say, well, that was America a long time ago. But be careful. America doesn't stand still, and we're not that far from an age where we might be called upon to inform on old associates and so on, and people we saw at meetings and parties. We're not there yet, but it can happen. And a country founded in optimism and thinking well of your fellows and of fellowship itself can turn scared very fast. And a film like this, and a film like Good Night and Good Luck, which is just opening now, they have great lessons to tell, I think. But I wanted you to just sort of have a sense of what this film meant for Kazan and for Bud Schulberg, who wrote the film. The Hook, the Arthur Miller version of the Waterfront story, collapsed because the studio that was backing it said, well, it's a good script, but we don't like the conclusion, because what you say is that organized crime is behind the corruption on the docks. Couldn't you say it's communism that's really ruining labor in America? And Arthur Miller turned his back on the project at that point. So Kazan met up with Schulberg, who also had a waterfront story, and Schulberg had also testified. Lee J. Cobb, who plays Johnny Friendly in the film, had also testified. And like Kazan, led a sort of ruined life for the rest of his years. Never got over it, agonized over it. And so the atmosphere during the making of this film, and it was made on the waterfront, as you can see, in the winter, very tough conditions, a lot of mobsters just off camera watching how it was going, taking an active interest, a difficult film to make, a film that I think was really only dragged into being by that extraordinary producer, Sam Spiegel, who would later go on to make Lawrence of Arabia, a real maverick in the history of production, and brought this very difficult project into being. One last little story before I stop and you can ask some questions is that this film came out in '54. Kazan testified in '52. And Brando, who knew Kazan very, very well, I mean, they were close at that time, was later asked in an interview, since you knew what Kazan was doing in the way of testifying, because it was in all the papers, why did you work for him? And Brando said, and you can either take this as a measure of an actor thinking he can say anything and get away with it, or a measure of really how little about the world Brando knew. And again, I don't know which way to come down. Brando said, I didn't know it was going on at the time. Actors get very caught up in what they do. This is the film, of course, that won Brando his first Oscar. And it comes really, it's sadly, the last film in a great run of pictures that begins with The Men, Streetcar Named Desire, The Wild One, Viva Zapata. And when he was, I think, at his best. And I'm not sure that he's absolutely convincing as an ex-boxer, but as an ex-boxer poet, I think he's tremendous and fabulous. And it still looks a fantastic film. One tiny last thing. Film was photographed by a man named Boris Kaufman. People who know their film history will know Boris Kaufman because 25 years before, he had photographed one of the most beautiful films ever made, Jean Vigo's L'Atalante in France. And about 10 years before that, as Boris Vertov, he had been a Russian, a communist in the first great age of Bolshevik excitement with films, working on the Kino trains. And for him, having come all that way to be present and tremendous enabler of Kazan's vision, it must have been a lesson in irony.